Detective Sarah Chun wiped the sweat from her forehead as she navigated her way through the bustling streets of Seattle. The summer heat was unrelenting, making the usually pleasant Pacific Northwest feel more like a furnace. As one of the DEA's top agents, she had spent the last 6 months working undercover to infiltrate a sophisticated pharmaceutical trafficking ring. Today was supposed to be the day everything came together. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message from her handler. They had solid intelligence that the ring's leader, Marcus Reynolds, was planning a major shipment through the port of Seattle. Sarah had worked tirelessly to gain Reynolds' trust, and now she was closer than ever to bringing down his entire operation. The city streets were packed with tourists and locals alike, all seeking refuge from the scorching sun in the shadows of towering skyscrapers. Sarah's unmarked vehicle crawled through the congested traffic, her mind focused on the upcoming operation. That's when she noticed something odd in her rearview mirror, a white SUV that had been following her for the past 15 minutes. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered, making a sudden right turn onto a less crowded street. The SUV followed. Sarah's training kicked in as she took another unexpected turn. Then another. Each time, the white SUV remained steadfastly behind her. Her heart rate quickened as she reached for her radio to contact her team, but before she could press the button, red and blue lights flashed behind her. The SUV was a police vehicle, unmarked, but definitely law enforcement. Sarah pulled over, her mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. No local law enforcement was supposed to be involved in today's operation. She grabbed her DEA credentials, ready to sort out what she assumed was a simple misunderstanding. The officer who approached her window was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His nameplate read, Captain Morrison. "License and registration," he barked, barely glancing at her. "Captain, I'm Agent Sarah Chun with the DEA. I'm currently on an active operation." She held out her credentials, maintaining a professional tone despite the growing unease in her stomach. Morrison barely looked at her badge before sneering. "Step out of the vehicle. Sir, I don't think you understand. I'm a federal agent in the middle of an ongoing investigation. If you could just contact your supervisor." "I said step out of the vehicle." Morrison's voice rose sharply, drawing the attention of passing pedestrians. Some stopped to watch, phones already out and recording. Sarah's mind raced. Something was very wrong here. This wasn't standard procedure, and Morrison's aggressive behavior set off every alarm bell in her head. But she also knew that causing a scene could jeopardize months of careful undercover work. "Captain, I'm going to comply, but I want to be clear that I'm a federal agent, and this stop is interfering with an active investigation." She slowly opened her door, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. Morrison grabbed her arm roughly as soon as she stepped out, spinning her around and slamming her against the car. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed in her ears as pedestrians gasped and whispered nearby. "Federal agent, huh?" Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. "We'll see about that." Sarah winced as the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Through the growing crowd of onlookers, she caught sight of a young officer standing by the SUV, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. Officer Rivera, according to his nameplate, seemed to be the only one who recognized that something wasn't right about this arrest. "Captain, she does have federal credentials," Rivera spoke up hesitantly. "Shouldn't we at least verify?" "Get back in the car, Rivera," Morrison snapped. "I'll handle this." As Morrison roughly guided her toward his vehicle, Sarah's trained eye caught something that made her blood run cold. In his jacket pocket was a small package with a familiar logo, the same one used by Reynolds' drug operation. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was working for Reynolds. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, likely her team wondering why she wasn't in position. The operation was falling apart, and worse, she was now in the custody of someone who was clearly working for the very criminal she was trying to bring down. As Morrison shoved her into the back of his SUV, Sarah caught Officer Rivera's eye again. The young officer was clearly struggling with what he was witnessing, and in that brief moment of eye contact, Sarah saw something she desperately needed: doubt. The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a crowd of murmuring onlookers and one very conflicted young officer. Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine not only the fate of her investigation but possibly her life as well. Morrison drove erratically through the city, taking back roads and side streets, clearly avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be seen. Sarah memorized every turn, every landmark, building a mental map of their route. Her training had prepared her for situations like this, but the reality was far more intense than any simulation. You really thought you could walk into my city and start poking around without consequences? Morrison's voice was cold as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Reynolds sends his regards. Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. Morrison wasn't just corrupted by Reynolds' organization. He was a key player. This explained how the drug ring had managed to operate so efficiently in Seattle. They had protection from the inside. How long have you been on Reynolds' payroll, Morrison? Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Does your whole department know they're working for a drug trafficker? Morrison's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. You don't know anything about this city or how it works. Sometimes keeping the peace means making deals with devils. Reynolds keeps the streets orderly. No gang wars, no territory disputes. Everyone gets their cut, and everyone stays happy, except for the people dying from the contaminated drugs his organization pushes, Sarah shot back. Or did you conveniently forget about the teenagers who overdosed last month? Morrison's face darkened. Casualties happen in every business. The alternative is chaos. The SUV turned down an isolated industrial street lined with abandoned warehouses. Sarah's heart rate increased as she realized they were heading into an area where anything could happen without witnesses. But just then, she noticed something in her peripheral vision. A familiar sedan trying to maintain a discreet distance behind them. Officer Rivera had followed them. Maybe he wasn't as corrupted as his superior after all. Morrison pulled into a derelict warehouse, the metal door groaning as it rolled shut behind them. The space was vast and empty, save for a few old shipping containers and scattered debris. As Morrison yanked her out of the vehicle, Sarah caught a glimpse of Rivera's car parking quietly outside through a broken window. You know this isn't going to end well for you, Morrison, Sarah said, playing for time. The DEA knows I'm here. They'll be looking for me. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. By the time they find you, if they ever do, it'll be too late. Reynolds has plans for federal agents who don't know their place. Sarah stood in the dim warehouse, her mind racing through possible scenarios. The afternoon sun filtered through dirty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. She could hear distant traffic and the occasional rumble of planes overhead, reminders of the bustling city continuing its normal day just beyond these walls. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the vast space. Reynolds isn't loyal to anyone. The moment you become a liability, he'll dispose of you just like he did with his last police contact in Portland. Morrison's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Detective James Porter, Sarah replied, noting how Morrison's face paled slightly. Remember him? Found in his car last year, made to look like a suicide. But we both know Reynolds ordered that hit when Porter started asking for a bigger cut. You're lying, Morrison growled, but uncertainty flickered across his face. Am I? Why don't you ask Reynolds about it? Oh wait, you can't because he doesn't take calls from his street-level enforcers, does he? You're just another pawn, Morrison. Disposable. Morrison's face contorted with rage. He stepped forward, raising his hand, but before he could strike, a voice rang out through the warehouse. Captain, stop. Officer Rivera stood in a side doorway, his service weapon drawn and aimed at Morrison. His hands were steady, but his voice trembled slightly. Put the gun down, Rivera, Morrison snarled. You don't want to do this. I think I do, sir, Rivera replied, his voice growing firmer. I followed you because something felt wrong about this arrest. Then I called in Agent Chen's credentials. She's telling the truth. She's DEA, and this is an active federal investigation. Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, but Rivera's voice stopped him. Don't. I've already called it in. Backup is on the way. Sarah could see Morrison's mind working, calculating his options. The warehouse had suddenly become very quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Think about what you're doing, Rivera, Morrison said, his voice taking on an almost paternal tone. You're young. You've got a promising career ahead of you. Don't throw it away over some federal agent's word. What about the overdose victims? Rivera demanded. The teenagers? I saw you pulling files, making evidence disappear. I kept quiet because I was afraid. But not anymore. Morrison's face hardened. You don't understand how this city works, kid. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to keep the peace. No, Rivera shook his head. That's just what corrupt cops tell themselves to sleep at night. Suddenly, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Morrison's head snapped toward the sound, And in that moment of distraction, Sarah made her move. Despite her handcuffs, she managed to drive her shoulder into Morrison's midsection, knocking him off balance. Rivera rushed forward, keeping his weapon trained on Morrison as the older officer stumbled backward. "Don't move, Captain." The warehouse doors burst open, and sunlight flooded in along with a team of DEA agents, their weapons drawn. Sarah's partner, Agent Marcus Thompson, was in the lead. "DEA, everyone on the ground." Morrison slowly raised his hands, his face a mask of fury and defeat. As one of the agents uncuffed Sarah, she turned to Rivera. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That took courage." Rivera holstered his weapon, looking both relieved and shell-shocked. "I couldn't let him get away with it anymore. The department's supposed to stand for something better than this." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from her surveillance team. Reynolds had been spotted at the port. Despite everything that had happened, the operation was still on. "Think you're still up for taking down a drug ring today?" she asked Rivera with a slight smile. The young officer straightened his shoulders and nodded. "After this? Absolutely." Sarah turned to her team, already planning their next move. Morrison's arrest would shake things up, but it might also give them the perfect opportunity to catch Reynolds off guard. The day wasn't over yet, and there was still work to be done. "Thompson," she called to her partner, "get me everything Morrison had on him. Phone, keys, badge, anything that might give us insight into Reynolds' operation. Rivera, I need you to contact your department's internal affairs. This goes deeper than just Morrison, and we're gonna need help cleaning house." The warehouse was now a flurry of activity, with agents securing the scene and documenting evidence. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being close to cracking a case. Morrison's corruption had nearly derailed everything, but now it might be the key to finally bringing down Reynolds' entire organization. Sarah's mind buzzed with the possibilities as she and Rivera exited the warehouse. The sirens faded into the background, replaced by the hum of the city. She watched as Morrison was loaded into a DEA vehicle, his eyes still burning with defiance. There was no time to savor the small victory. Reynolds was still out there, and every second counted. Rivera walked beside her, his face pale but resolute. "What's next?" he asked, his voice tight with adrenaline. Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Surveillance update. Reynolds spotted at Pier 34. Shipment inbound. The plan was back on, but now it was personal. "We move fast," Sarah replied, her tone sharp. "Reynolds is at the port, probably coordinating the shipment. We can't let this slip away." They climbed into one of the DEA vehicles, Rivera sliding into the passenger seat. As they sped toward the port, Sarah filled him in. "Reynolds is expecting this shipment to go smoothly. Morrison was probably supposed to intercept any trouble. Without him, Reynolds might get nervous. That's our advantage." Rivera nodded, gripping the dashboard. "Do you think Morrison tipped him off?" "Not likely. He barely had time to think, let alone contact anyone. But Reynolds is smart. He'll be watching for anything unusual." The port loomed ahead, its cranes towering like silent sentinels. The air was thick with salt and diesel, and the shadows stretched long in the late afternoon sun. Sarah parked a few blocks away, slipping her firearm from its holster. She glanced at Rivera. "Stay close. Watch my six." They moved silently through the maze of shipping containers, the sounds of forklifts and distant voices masking their footsteps. Sarah's eyes scanned every shadow, every movement. She spotted a group of men near a large container, their body language tense. In the center stood Marcus Reynolds, a tall, lean man with an air of calculated menace. "This is it," Sarah whispered. She signaled to the rest of her team, who fanned out, taking up positions around the perimeter. Reynolds glanced at his watch, impatience flickering across his face. He turned to one of his men, barking orders. Sarah counted 6 armed guards. Not ideal but manageable. She nodded to Rivera. On my signal, they crept closer, using the containers for cover. Sarah steadied her breathing, focusing on the target. Then she stepped out, weapon raised. "DA, drop your weapons." Chaos erupted. Reynolds' men spun around, guns drawn, but the DA team was already closing in. Shots rang out, echoing off the metal containers. Rivera stayed at Sarah's side, his movements precise and controlled. Reynolds locked eyes with Sarah, a slow smile spreading across his face. He turned and bolted, slipping between the containers. Sarah cursed, giving chase. Rivera followed, his footsteps pounding in sync with hers. Reynolds was fast, but Sarah's determination fueled her. She rounded a corner and saw him ahead, sprinting toward a waiting black SUV. Reynolds! Stop! He glanced back, his face a mask of arrogance. Too late, agent. But as he reached for the door, Rivera's voice rang out. Freeze! He stood at the end of the alley, gun aimed directly at Reynolds. Reynolds hesitated, his eyes darting between them. Sarah advanced, her weapon steady. It's over. There's nowhere left to run. For a moment it seemed like he might try anyway. Then, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, and he dropped the keys, raising his hands. Sarah cuffed him, her voice low. Your empire is done. Morrison's already talking. It's over. Reynolds' smirk faltered. You think this ends with me? There's always someone else ready to take the throne. Not this time, Sarah replied, guiding him toward the waiting DEA vehicles. We're cleaning house. As Reynolds was led away, Rivera turned to her. We got him. But he's right, isn't he? There's always someone else. Sarah met his gaze. That's why we stay vigilant. One victory at a time. They stood in the fading light, the weight of what they'd accomplished settling in. The battle wasn't over, but today, they'd made a difference. And that was enough. For now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the port was a flurry of flashing lights and agents cataloging evidence. Sarah watched Reynolds being loaded into the back of a secure DEA van. His cold stare still held defiance, but there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty. The facade of invincibility had cracked. Rivera stood beside her, hands on his hips, his eyes scanning the chaos. It doesn't feel real, he said, voice low. I've idolized some of these guys. Morrison, Reynolds, they seemed untouchable. Sarah nodded, her gaze distant. They count on that. On people looking up to them, thinking they're above the law. That's how corruption spreads. They walked back toward the command center, where Agent Marcus Thompson was waiting. He held up a phone bagged as evidence. Morrison's. There are encrypted files. It'll take time, but this could blow the whole thing wide open. Names, payments, everything. Sarah's eyes sharpened. Get it to the tech team. We need those files cracked yesterday. Thompson nodded and hurried away. Rivera watched him go, then turned to Sarah. What happens to Morrison now? He'll face charges. With what he knows, he'll probably cut a deal to reduce his sentence. But his career is over, Sarah replied. She glanced at Rivera. Internal affairs will clean out the department. People will fall, but it won't be easy. There are always more shadows. Rivera exhaled deeply. I'll be testifying, won't I? Sarah's expression softened. Yes, you're brave, Rivera. You did the right thing today. He swallowed, his eyes serious. I hope it's enough. My family, my career, everything could change. It already has, Sarah said. For the better. You've set a new standard. Others will follow. Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed. Another update. Reynolds' lieutenant spotted at a nightclub downtown. Possible intel leak. She glanced at Rivera, a tired smile playing at her lips. Ready for another round? He straightened, determination in his eyes. Always. They walked back to the car, the city's lights stretching out before them, a reminder of the battles yet to come. Corruption ran deep, but so did justice. And for now, that was enough.